Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Advanced Cognitive Processes. I am Ark Verma from ID Kanpur. We are in the 7th week of the course, and in this week we have been discussing about cognition and emotion. In the last few lectures in this week, I have talked to you about the interactions of emotional states, that is mood states, with attention, memory. We have been in discussion about how important region of the brain amygdala is and how it helps us process particular emotions. In the last lecture, I also started talking to you about the effects of particular kinds of emotion on the process of judgment and decision making. We will continue our conversation with respect to that, and let us now talk about a couple of other emotions. Let's talk about sadness and decision making. Now, sadness resembles anxiety because both are negative emotional states. But one of the things that characterizes sadness more than anxiety is that sadness is related to more of an absence of positive effect as compared to anxiety. Sadness is, in some sense, we keep positive emotions, happy and sad, on the two continuum, and in that sense sadness is basically referred to as some more of a loss of, or more of a deficiency of any positive effect. So that is one of the things that characteristically differentiates sadness from anxiety. Now, because sadness is basically about the absence of positive effect, it's kind of almost intuitive to expect that sad individuals experience environment as being relatively unrewarding. It is not happy, it is relatively unrewarding, and this often motivates sad people to try and avoid the sadness, to try and come out of the sad state. And in that sense, they would sometimes, they are in that sense seeking some kinds of rewards. They are continuously trying to not be sad, they are continuously trying to change their scenario. So that is something which you will have to remember about what sad people behave like. Now, people have studied the effects of sadness and judgment in decision making, and Waters basically did this review wherein he kind of reviews several studies on the basis of how what kind of emotions interact with decision making processes. Now, sadness was actually found to basically regard the likelihood, sad individuals were found to regard the likelihood of negative events as more probable. They basically think, if you ask them whether there is a possibility that you would have a serious illness, or there will be death, or there will be destruction, those kind of things. So sad individuals were found to regard the likelihood of health hazards and adverse life events much greater than happy individuals. In a study on risk aversion by Raghunath and Pham in 1999, sadness caused participants to select the high risk job. 78% of the participants selected the high risk job as compared to only 56% of the people who were in the neutral mood. You remember I was talking about two jobs, job A and job B, where job A is a high salary, low job security job, and job B is average salary, high job security job. So in this study, 78% of the sad individuals were okay to take the risk. I was referring to this tendency, trying to come out of this stage, even though taking risks is involved. So 78% of individuals took that risk. They wanted the high salary, low job security job because they want to come out of their state. Also, this finding can be explained on the basis that participants were motivated to obtain the reward of high pay associated with the high risk option. They're not really, in that sense, for them everything is anyways going to go downhill, so why not really die trying. That's kind of the attitude that sad individuals or extremely sad individuals will display in different situations. Now, some of the research has focused on the decision-making processes that these individuals use when they are in sad mood. Now, when you're talking about particular kind of a decision-making process, literature has basically distinguished two kinds of processing, two kinds of evolution or evaluation of alternatives that goes on. So firstly, there is a systematic or analytic processing where the individual considers all options, weighs them, compares them against each other, this one is relatively slow and it's rather consciously controlled. This is the analytic processing, deliberative processing. Second is there is the heuristic processing, which is relatively effortless and it involves use of heuristics. Heuristics are shortcuts which may work, may not work, but they are shortcuts, they give results very quickly. So sad individuals, basically people have said, there is evidence that sad individuals tend to use the analytic processing a lot more as compared to heuristic processing. In a literature review, Schwartz in the year 2000 concluded that being in a sad mood causes people to use a processing strategy in which much of the attention is paid to details. Analysis are done, options are weighed, how will I come out of my sadness? These things are done. So you will say that sad individuals use analytical processing, deliberative processing a lot more as compared to individuals affected with different other kinds of emotions. Now, DeVries and colleagues in 2008 hypothesized that people are most satisfied with their decision making when they have used a preferred strategy. So they just wanted to test that what kind of decision making strategies people are used, and they found that people are satisfied when they have used a strategy they would prefer. So they tested this by requiring participants to use either a heuristic intuitive way or analytic deliberative way of processing when making a particular decision. Now, as predicted, participants put into a sad mood by watching a clip from the Schindler's List. It was a amazing movie. Schindler's List were more satisfied with their decision following analytic and deliberative style of processing, and than they were when they were supposed to use the heuristic or intuitive kind of processing. So in that sense, again, it kind of confirms this thing that sad individuals are using analytic processing, paying attention to all of the details, weighing everything before making the final decision. Now, so that was about sadness. Let us talk about a different emotion. Let's talk about anger. Now, anger is a negative emotion. Anger is something that is not really desirable. But I'll just kind of briefly mention that anger, even though it is regarded broadly as a negative emotional state, it can be a moderately positive emotion as well. It can be viewed as a moderately positive emotion as well. If the individual believed he or she can control the situation and dominate the disliked others. Sometimes in a place of anger, you think that, okay, if I am going to show anger, the other person is going to listen to me. If I am going to show anger, the other person will be afraid of me and they will agree to whatever I have to say. So, we were talking about sadness, and there is obviously enough evidence now that sadness kind of makes individuals follow the analytic, deliberative kind of style of processing. But now let's move on to a different emotion. Let's talk about anger. Now, anger is a negative emotion. Anger is a state that you would not really want to be in. But anger, even though it's a negative emotional state, it can be viewed as a moderately positive emotion if the individual believes that he or she can control the situation better or can dominate the disliked others. The fact is, say for example, if somebody feels that if I am angry, if I am showing anger, the other people will listen to me. If I am angry, everybody will be afraid of me and I can get whatever I want, just that display of anger. So one of the things is sometimes people start misconstruing their anger as a positive emotion, and they kind of reinforce ways in which they can show and harbor anger, and they can make use of their anger whenever they want to. Now this is interesting. So there is a sort of a literature which says that some people might view anger as more masculine and more power kind of a thing. So obviously there is a slight evidence that says that maybe some people in some sense construe anger as a slightly positive emotion. I'll come back to that in a bit. Now, another important thing about anger is that there are very important cross-cultural differences in the way anger is perceived, is understood or expressed. In some cultures, anger is considered nice, it's considered, let us say it could be considered more powerful, more masculine, more acceptable in their culture, but in other cultures, it could be completely opposite. An example I would take is the Machuanga people in the Peruvian Amazon. They are basically a very peace-loving people, and they basically would rather be afraid than be angry. They try and avoid anger at all costs. So this is interesting that how anger is understood across cultures and societies might also be very different. So how do you measure the effect of anger on decision making? How does this really happen? There is one very interesting term, it's a very interesting German term, which kind of also links anger to the positive emotion thing, is that anger can lead to a positive emotional state if Schadenfreude is happening. So Schadenfreude is basically a term which is about experiencing pleasure at the misfortune of others. Now, Harley and Weiner in 2002, they found that Schadenfreude is basically in greater is greater for people who are angry. So Leach and Spears also, they kind of conducted this research, and they were kind of studying a fictitious competition among two universities, and the students were basically supposed to react to one of the universities winning. So one of the universities winning. So the failure of the more successful university basically generated more Schadenfreude in the in these participants. So much of this Schadenfreude was basically occurring because of the participants' anger based on the inferiority of their own university. So because they know that their university is not doing very well and it's slightly inferior to the other one, to the major university. So when this major university is losing, these people are deriving some joy out of it. So this is a little bit about how anger can be, construed in some cases as a positive emotion. Let us come back to the conventional thing. Anger is obviously a negative emotion. Anger is something that is difficult to handle. So events associated with anger, or events that kind of cause or trigger anger are obviously remembered as unpleasant events. In addition, the consequences of anger, basically, aggression, violence, etc., can also lead to more negative emotional states. It kind of fuels this entire vicious cycle. Now, the effects of anger on judgment are very different from those of anxiety or sadness. Now, that is very important to remember. So Waters in 2008, he kind of mentions in a review that anger was generally associated with fairly optimistic judgments about the likelihood of negative events. People who are who should display a lot of anger, who are generally more angry, they kind of make more optimistic judgments about how things will happen. It is kind of puzzling though. In other words, basically Waters says that the perceived likelihood of negative events is also low. And in contrast, both sadness and anxiety basically are associated with more pessimistic judgments. So it's amazing that how anger is kind of biasing people to make more positive judgments. The optimism of angry individuals, I mean, again, I'm saying, is slightly surprising in the view of the fact that these are individuals who are, those individuals who are characteristically angry have a much more chance of having cardiovascular problems or getting divorced and those kind of things. One of the hunches that I could actually share with you is that probably because anger is emotion which is closely linked with power, and you cannot be angry at a person who is who's more powerful than you, things like that. So maybe that relationship is kind of contributing to this aspect that angry individuals make more optimistic judgments about how life will pan out for them. So that's basically very interesting. Also, as I was saying, this aspect of power. So anger is associated with perceived control over others. Those people who can afford to show anger, who can afford to express anger, perceive themselves more in control of others as compared to individuals who are sad or anxious. So that's one thing. So angry individuals, they feel in control, and thus they kind of think that they can determine their own destiny, which makes them optimistic and more confident about the future. In contrast, anxious and sad individuals, they have much less perceived controls, and they basically feel themselves at the mercy of fate. Whatever the situations will pan out, we'll have to live through them and those kind of things. So as a result, they are more pessimistic about the future. They kind of do not really have a lot of positive things to look forward to in life. So I mean, that's the contrast that you could make. Now, it is popularly assumed that anger greatly reduces our ability to think rationally and to make sensible decisions. So there was this quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson in a particular movie, and it says, "Anger blows the light out of the reason." Anger blows out the light of reason. So the idea is, if you're angry, you're not capable of making rational, correct, properly measured judgments. Let us look at some evidence about this. So Brighton, Goldman, and Goodman Delahunty in 2006, they kind of wanted to conduct a study where participants were mock jurors, and they had to decide on the guilt or innocence of a man who was alleged to have murdered his wife. Now, so this judgment was supposed to be made. Now, some of these jurors were basically made angry by showing them gruesome photographs taken of the murdered woman. The angry jurors so the kind of anger is induced. What was found was that these angry jurors were more than 4 times likely, than the non-angry ones to award a guilty verdict. So, it's certain that their decision is, decision making is being influenced by the fact that they are angry. So that is one evidence. Another example was reported by Coleman in 2010, fairly recently. He studied the sunk cost heuristic. Sunk cost is basically it's an increased tendency to invest resources in an uncertain project following previous failure with that project. So if you think, okay, this is not really turning out well, but you're kind of still pumping in money in that project, so that it does not all go bad. It's like putting good money after bad. Some money has already been lost, but you're kind of trying to put in more money so that you recover that aspect. So Coleman in 2010 used a hypothetical problem in which the students could decide whether to do a course for which they had already paid in advance without an extra cost, or they could switch to a course offering a better chance of success. So this was the thing. The key finding was that the sunk cost effect was greater in angry participants than those in a sad or a neutral mood. So thus anger is kind of increasing the tendency for students to make a suboptimal decision. So they are kind of following the sunk cost heuristic. Now one could ask this question that why is it happening that anger is impairing the quality of decision making. So there are some answers which can be discussed. So according to Litwak and colleagues 2010, anger leads to increased use of heuristic processing. We're talking about sad individuals using analytic processing. So anger is leading to the increased use of heuristic processing and reduced use of analytic processing. So what is happening is that they are not weighing the options completely. They are kind of, in some sense, probably overconfident, and they're optimistic in their judgments, and so they are kind of taking shortcuts and just doing what the anger is asking them to do. Convincing evidence that anger increases the use of heuristic processing was provided by Small and Lerner in 2008. So it was a task where participants were given a decision-making task, and they had to decide how much welfare assistance should be received by Patricia Smith, a fictitious character who was a 25-year-old divorced woman with 3 children. Now, angry participants somehow awarded her less assistance. They did not really look into the entire situation, whatever the conditions were, than the neutral or the sad mood state participants. There was also a further condition in which these angry participants had to perform an extra, additionally cognitively demanding task at the same time as they were making these decisions. This was basically done in order to check whether these extra task has coerces them to use a different method. But the key finding was that the addition of a second cognitively demanding task did not really affect the amount of the welfare assistance that this lady was awarded. Now, the implication of this kind of a setting is that angry participants primarily are using a heuristic processing even in the presence or absence of a secondary task. So basically the whole point is that they just wanted to follow a particular kind of a shortcut, and they are actually going by it. Now further, Ask and Granhag in 2007, they induced anger in experienced police investigators by asking them to recall an event that they had encountered during their police work, and that would have caused anger or sadness. So two kinds of emotions are invoked. After that, police investigators read the summary of a criminal case together with the statements by 2 witnesses. Now, they had to judge these witnesses on several measures like reliability, trustworthiness, and so on. And they had to judge the probability of the guilt of among the 2 witnesses. Now, the key finding here was that angry participants engaged in more heuristic or superficial looking of the facts, superficial processing of the information about the case than did sad ones. So here you can see how angry and sad people are processing the same information that is being given to them. For example, the judgments made by the angry participants were less influenced than those of the sad participants by the content of the witness statement. They're just kind of made up their mind, and they're not really getting into the detail of the statements. Okay, so this is again proof of the fact that anger is not really a very conducive emotion to decision making. So that was about anger. Let us move to positive mood, happiness, optimism. What does it do for decision making? Let's talk about that. Now, positive mood has been linked to what is referred to as an optimistic bias. Generally, people who are happier, who are more positive, they tend to show what is called an optimistic bias. They judge, the judgment is that we are more likely than other people to experience positive events, but less likely than other people to experience negative events. Individuals in a positive or a good mood, they would continuously try and continue this state. They will try and maintain this state of happiness. They will try and avoid anything that could actually end this happiness, that could disturb this happiness. So Drace and colleagues in 2009, they carried out several experiments on the optimistic bias with mood state being manipulated. So the idea was they wanted to test the optimistic bias, but they wanted to manipulate the mood of the participants and see how this optimistic bias changes with different mood. There was much general evidence, and they kind of were using pictures and music to induce these moods. There was much general evidence for optimistic bias in their study, in the task they did. More importantly, however, the extent of this optimistic bias was very similar across both positive, negative, and neutral mood states. So, for people who are generally happy, their optimism kind of extends across the board. Okay, the negative findings of Drace and colleagues, however, contrasted with previous research. So, in this study, you see there is no difference in the kind of optimism bias that is existing across people who are having positive states, negative states, or even neutral states. Now, that is not really what the literature had been saying till recently. So, it's just one negative study, where the earlier research has been showing consistently that individuals in a positive mood state perceive themselves as less likely to experience negative events than did sad individuals. So that is something that is established, and Waters kind of wrote about this in 2008. Also, individuals in a positive mood state are typically associated with a risk-averse approach to decision making. So they don't really want to take risks that could disturb their current state of happiness. For example, Mustansky in 2007, he carried out a diary study on men who were having sex with other men, and they were kind of trying to see the prevalence of HIV risk behaviors. They found that the HIV risk behaviors was much less among the men who experienced high levels of positive effects. So they were actually taking care that they do not get the disease, taking all the precautions that were supposed to be taken in order to avoid ending their happy state. So that's interesting to look at, isn't it? Now, talking about a different study, Kahir and Thomas in 2010, they wanted to study decision making involving imaginary betting on horse races. So they found that participants in a positive mood state made less risky bets, they made less risky decisions than those participants who were in a neutral state or in a sad emotion, for example. Why are people in positive state not taking risk? Why are they becoming more risk averse? You would assume that because sad people are going out of their way to take risk, 78% of them kind of choosing job A, the more riskier job. Why are happy people not doing that? One of the reasons is, the most likely reason probably is that someone who is happy is actually motivated to maintain the state of happiness. They would do anything to avoid being any less happier. And that is probably what is, kind of summing up these people's behavior. So, yeah, I mean, but the thing is that you can, somebody could argue that this is a rather post hoc kind of an explanation. You see the result, then you're kind of saying that, okay, this is happening. Because suppose it had been found that individuals in a positive mood are less risk averse, then it would be plausibly argued that individuals in a positive mood believe themselves largely immune from danger. They are so very confident, much like the angry people, they are so very confident that they are inclined to take more risk. So again, there's not a really clear evidence weighing on either side of this balance. So that's that. But much research on mood and decision making has made use of the distinction between analytic and deliberative processing and heuristic processing. So the idea is they actually wanted to test how people in positive mood make their decisions. So DeVries and colleagues, they argued that people who use their preferred processing strategy are more content with the decision they make than those who are using a non-preferred strategy. So they did this study. Participants were put into a happy mood by showing them a video clip from the movie The Muppet Show, from the serial The Muppet Show, whereas others were put into a sad mood by showing them a clip from Schindler's List. The findings that DeVries and colleagues obtained supported their hypothesis. Happy participants were more satisfied, having made the heuristic intuitive judgments, and the findings for sad people were precisely the opposite. They were happier if they were kind of making use of the analytic and deliberative process of making decisions. So people are generally more content with the decisions when there is a fit between their mood and the strategy they are employing. So let me summarize this for you. We have talked about four kinds of emotions: anxiety, sadness, anger, and positive mood. And there are three kind of aspects we've talked about: what kind of judgment these people would make, what is their attitude towards risk, and what are the processing styles they are following. So you can see here, anxious people, pessimistic judgment, risk averse, inefficient heuristic based processing. Sad people, pessimistic judgments, risk taking behavior because they want to come out of it at any cost, but they follow analytic and deliberative processing. Angry people are generally optimistic, they are risk taking, and they kind of follow the heuristic heuristic approach to processing. Now, positive mood people, are they optimistic? Are they happier? What is the case? Generally optimistic. They are also risk averse, and they are also using heuristic methods of making decisions. So this is from my side about emotional states, mood states, and decision making. We'll talk to you about in the next class about a different topic again in cognition and emotion. Thank you.